If she stopped moving, she would freeze where she fell. The wind came screaming across the open Wyoming plains, tearing at Clara Whitmore's thin dress like it meant to strip her down to bone, each gust sharper than the last, each breath a struggle that burned cold in her chest. Snow whipped sideways, blinding, relentless, swallowing the land until there was no sky, no ground, just white and the sound of her own ragged breathing. She stumbled, her boots sinking deep, legs shaking so hard she could barely feel them anymore. And for a moment she thought about letting go, just for a second, just to rest. That was how it happened, she knew. People did not fall asleep out here. They disappeared. Her hand tightened around the small cloth bag at her side, the last thing she owned, light enough to remind her how little she had left, heavy enough to keep her moving. One more step, then another. Somewhere ahead, through the storm, a flicker of something broke the endless white. A light, dim, unsteady, but real. Her head lifted, slow, disbelieving, as the shape of a cabin began to form out of the storm, dark wood against the pale fury of the world, a thin line of smoke dragged sideways by the wind. Warmth, shelter, or something worse. She had heard the stories about the man who lived out here, alone, miles from town, a rancher who did not come in unless he had to, who spoke little and watched too much. Ethan Cole. The name moved through her mind like a warning she no longer had the strength to obey. Her foot caught on something buried beneath the snow and she went down hard, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs, the cold biting instantly through the thin fabric at her knees and palms. For a second, she did not move. The wind howled over her, filling her ears, pressing her into the ground as if the land itself wanted to claim her. Stay down, it seemed to whisper. Stay? Her fingers twitched, then dug into the snow. She pushed up, shaking, her arms barely holding, her vision narrowing at the edges as the cabin blurred in and out of sight. Too far. It was still too far. A sound slipped from her throat, not quite a cry, not quite a breath, and she forced herself forward again, dragging one foot, then the other, until the porch steps rose in front of her like something unreal. The wood groaned under her weight as she reached them, her hand slipping against the frost-slick railing, her body swaying as she pulled herself up. The door loomed inches away now, solid, closed, the only thing standing between her and the storm. Her hand lifted, hesitated. If the stories were true, stepping through that door might not be salvation. It might be something she could not take back. Another gust slammed into the cabin, rattling the boards, driving snow against her back so hard it stole what little heat she had left. Choice vanished with the warmth in her fingers. Her fist hit the door once, weak, barely a sound beneath the wind. She swallowed, forced her hand up again, and struck harder. The wood thudded under her knuckles. Then nothing. No movement. No answer. Her heart dropped, slow and heavy, as the cold crept deeper into her bones. She leaned her forehead against the door, eyes closing for just a second, just to gather what little strength she had left. Please, she whispered, the word lost to the storm. Silence stretched. Then, somewhere behind the door, a sound. Slow. Measured. A step. Clara's breath caught, her body going still despite the shaking, as the handle on the other side shifted just enough to make her pulse spike with something sharper than fear. The latch turned with a slow, deliberate click, the kind that carried weight even through the storm, and the door opened just enough for the wind to surge inside before a broad figure blocked it again, cutting the cold in half. He did not speak at first. He stood there, filling the frame, tall and unmoving, the lantern light behind him outlining the hard line of his shoulders, the worn edges of his coat, the stillness of a man who did not startle easy. Clara lifted her head, barely, her vision swimming, and met his eyes. They were not warm, not unkind either, just steady, watching, measuring. The wind howled between them, tugging at her hair, pushing her closer without permission, and she swayed where she stood, her body giving up piece by piece. He noticed. Of course he did. His gaze dropped once, quick, taking in the tremor in her hands, the way her breath came shallow and uneven, the thin fabric clinging to her frame as if it had forgotten how to protect her. Then his hand moved. Not fast. Never fast. He caught her by the arm just as her knees gave, his grip firm, controlled, enough to hold her, but not enough to hurt. You planning on freezing on my porch? His voice was low, rough from disuse, steady as the ground beneath them. She tried to answer, but the words stuck somewhere between her chest and her throat, tangled with the cold. I can work, she managed finally, the sentence breaking apart as it left her lips. His eyes lifted back to her face, and for a second something shifted there, not softness, not yet, but recognition. He had heard that line before. He knew what it meant. Need. Desperation. No place left to go. The wind pushed again, harder this time, and he stepped aside just enough to pull her inside, closing the door behind them with a solid thud that cut the storm off like a knife. Silence fell, thick and sudden, broken only by the crackle of fire from the hearth. The warmth hit her all at once, sharp, almost painful, and her body reacted before her mind could catch up, a violent shiver running through her from head to toe. She wrapped her arms around herself, instinct, but it did little. The cold was already too deep. He did not rush to help. He stood there, watching her, giving her a second to find her footing, to prove she could stand on her own. She tried. God, she tried. One step forward, then another. The room tilted. Her hand shot out, catching the edge of the table, fingers slipping against the wood. He moved then, closing the distance in 2 quiet steps, his presence sudden and undeniable at her side. Close now. Too close. She could feel the heat of him even through the layers between them, could hear the slow, even rhythm of his breathing, so different from her own. His hand came up again, this time to her wrist, turning it slightly, his thumb brushing over skin so cold it must have felt wrong beneath his touch. You are half frozen, he said, more observation than concern. She swallowed, forcing herself to meet his gaze again, to stay upright under it. I told you, she whispered, the words thinner now, worn down by everything she had already given just to get here. I can work. A pause. His grip did not tighten, but it did not release either. Control. Always control. His eyes searched hers, slower this time, as if looking for something beyond the obvious. Strength. Maybe. Or the lack of it. The fire cracked behind her, sending a flicker of light across his face, catching in the rough edges of stubble, the lines carved there by wind and years and silence. Work, he repeated quietly, and for the first time there was something else in his voice. Not doubt. Not quite. Something closer to a question he had not decided to ask yet. He stepped closer still, the space between them narrowing until she could feel the heat of the fire reflected off him, could feel the way the room seemed to shrink around them. Her breath caught, not just from the cold now. He noticed that too. Of course he did. This place does not need hands, he said, his voice dropping just enough to pull her attention tighter, to hold it there. A beat. The kind that stretched. The kind that changed things. His thumb shifted slightly against her wrist, grounding her, steadying her without asking permission. So tell me, he added, quieter now, his gaze locked on hers. What else can you offer? Her breath caught, shallow and uneven, as his question settled between them like something heavier than the storm outside, something that did not care how tired she was or how close she had come to freezing in the snow. Clara did not pull her wrist away, not because she was not aware of his grip, but because she understood what it meant. He was not holding her to hurt her. He was holding her to see if she would break. The fire cracked behind her, sharp and sudden, and she flinched before she could stop herself, her body betraying how close she still was to the edge. His eyes did not miss it. They did not miss anything. I can cook, she said again, but the words sounded smaller now, thinner, like they had already been dismissed before they fully formed. His thumb shifted slightly, a subtle pressure that steadied her when her balance threatened to slip again, but his gaze remained fixed, unyielding. That is not what I asked. The room felt tighter. Warmer, yes, but not safer. Not yet. Outside, the wind slammed against the cabin walls, a low, constant force that reminded her exactly what waited beyond that door. Cold. Dark. Nothing. Her stomach tightened at the thought, a hollow ache that had been there for days now, sharp enough to make her swallow hard just to keep her voice steady. I will do whatever is needed, she said, forcing the words out, forcing herself to meet his eyes even as something inside her resisted, something that still wanted to hold on to the last piece of herself that had not been traded away for survival. His expression did not change. If anything, it sharpened. He stepped closer, just a fraction, but it was enough. Enough for her to feel the difference in the air, the way his presence filled the space, the way her breath seemed to catch against his without ever touching. Control. Always his. Whatever is needed, he repeated, slower this time, as if testing the weight of her answer. His hand moved again, not releasing her, but sliding from her wrist to her palm, turning it upward. Her fingers trembled in his, not just from the cold now. He looked down at them, at the faint lines, the small cuts, the rawness left by wind and work and everything she had already endured. You have already given more than most would, he said quietly, almost to himself, and for a moment, just a moment, something softened in his tone. It did not last. His gaze lifted back to hers, steady again, measuring again. And still you came here. A pause, long enough to matter. Her throat tightened. There is nowhere else, she admitted, the truth falling between them with more weight than anything she had said before. No pride left in it. No pretense. Just fact. The wind howled again, louder this time, rattling the windows, pressing against the walls as if trying to force its way back in, and the sound pulled his attention for half a second, just enough for her to notice the shift. Not fear. Never that. Awareness. Calculation. When he looked back at her, something had changed. Not in what he saw, but in what he had decided. His grip loosened, just slightly, enough to give her the illusion of choice. Enough to test her again. You can leave, he said, his voice calm, almost indifferent, but the words cut sharper than the wind ever could. Her heart stuttered. Leave. Back into the storm. Back into the nothing that had nearly taken her already. Her body reacted before her mind could catch up, a small, involuntary step closer to him, as if drawn by something she did not fully understand. He noticed that too. Of course he did. His eyes darkened, not with anger, but with something more controlled, more deliberate. Or, he added, quieter now, the words settling into the space between them like a promise she was not sure she should trust. You stay, and you give me something this place has not had in a long time. Her pulse quickened, not from fear alone now, but from the weight of the choice pressing down on her, from the way his presence made it impossible to ignore what was being asked without ever saying it plainly. The firelight flickered across his face, catching in his eyes, and for the first time she saw it clearly. Not just control, not just distance. Something missing. Something he was not willing to name. Her lips parted, the answer forming before she fully understood it, before she fully understood what it might cost her. What is it, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, that you think I can give you? The fire snapped louder, a sharp crack that sent sparks twisting up the chimney, and for a moment neither of them moved, the silence between them thick enough to feel, heavier than the storm pressing against the cabin walls. Clara held his gaze, even as her body trembled, even as every instinct told her to lower her eyes, to accept whatever he decided, to survive. But something in her refused. Not pride. That had been worn down miles back in the snow. Something smaller. Harder. The last piece of herself that had not frozen yet. I am not something you can just take, she said, the words quiet but steady, surprising even her as they settled into the space between them. His eyes sharpened. Not anger. Interest. The shift was subtle, but it was there, like the first crack in ice before it breaks. The wind pushed against the cabin again, a long, low howl slipping through the seams of the wood, threading through the room and curling around them like a reminder of what waited outside. Clara felt it, the cold creeping back into her bones, and still she did not step away. Not this time. His hand remained around hers, but it stilled now, no longer testing, no longer turning, just holding, listening. You came to my door, he said, his voice lower than before, quieter, but no less controlled. In the middle of a storm that would have taken you before morning. A pause. His thumb shifted once, a slow, deliberate movement across her palm that sent a strange awareness up her arm. Not pain, not comfort, something in between. You are asking for shelter. His gaze dropped briefly to her lips, pale from the cold, then returned to her eyes with that same steady weight. Everything out here is a trade. The words hung there, undeniable, shaped by the land itself. Clara's breath hitched, but she did not look away. Then I will choose what I give, she said, softer now, but no less certain. The firelight flickered across her face, catching the exhaustion in her eyes, the determination beneath it, and for the first time, something in his expression shifted deeper than before. Not just interest, recognition. He stepped closer. The space between them disappeared, not in a rush, but in a slow, controlled advance that gave her every chance to step back. She did not. Her back brushed the edge of the table instead, the wood solid behind her, anchoring her in place as his presence filled the air in front of her. Close enough now that she could see the faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the roughness of his skin shaped by sun and wind and years without softness. Close enough to feel the warmth of him against the cold still clinging to her. His hand tightened just slightly, not enough to restrain, just enough to remind. Control. Always there. "And what makes you think you are in a position to set terms?" he asked, his voice barely above a murmur, but it carried through her like something heavier than sound. Clara swallowed, her throat dry, her pulse quickening under the weight of his gaze, under the closeness that made every breath feel shared. She could feel the heat of the fire at her back, the cold still trapped in her bones, and him. Between those two extremes, steady, unyielding, impossible to ignore. "Because if I walk back out that door," she said, each word measured, each one costing her something, "you will not stop me." A beat. The wind slammed against the cabin again, harder this time, rattling the walls, as if testing them both. His eyes did not leave hers, not even for a second. And then, slowly, something changed. Not in his stance, not in his grip, in his silence. It stretched, longer than before, heavier, filled with something unspoken that settled deep in her chest. His hand released hers at last, but he did not step back, did not create distance. If anything, the absence of his touch made the closeness sharper, more aware. "You are right," he said finally, his voice calm, steady, but carrying something new beneath it, something that had not been there before. "I would not stop you." Another pause. The fire cracked again, the light shifting, casting shadows that moved across his face, across hers, across the narrow space between them. "But you are not walking out that door," he added, quieter now, the certainty in his tone not forced, not claimed, just known. Clara's breath caught, her body going still as the weight of his words settled over her, not as a threat, but as something far more dangerous. A truth she had not yet decided if she wanted to believe. The silence did not break. It shifted, bending under the weight of something neither of them had said yet, something that lived in the space between heat and cold, between leaving and staying, between him and her. Clara felt it before she understood it. Her knees weakened, not from the storm this time, but from the sudden release of tension she had been holding since the moment she stepped onto his porch. The room tilted again, slower now, heavier, and her hand slipped from the edge of the table. For a second, she thought she could steady herself. She was wrong. Her body gave in all at once. He caught her before she hit the floor. Not gently, not rough either, just certain. His arm came around her, pulling her into him with a firmness that left no space for hesitation, his other hand bracing her shoulder as if he had already decided she was not falling again. The heat of him was immediate, solid, real, cutting through the cold that still clung to her like a second skin. Clara inhaled sharply, her breath catching against his chest, the scent of leather, smoke, and something unmistakably him filling her senses. For a moment, she did not move, could not. Her fingers curled instinctively against the front of his coat, gripping without thinking, as if letting go might send her back into the storm. He felt it. Of course he did. His body stilled for half a heartbeat, then adjusted, not pulling away, not loosening his hold, but shifting just enough to support her weight more fully, to make it easier for her to stay upright without asking for it. Control. Still there, but different now. "You are not steady," he said quietly, his voice closer than before, low enough that she felt it as much as heard it. Clara swallowed, her forehead brushing briefly against his shoulder as she fought to regain control of herself, to step back, to prove she was not as weak as her body insisted she was. She tried. Her hands pushed lightly against him, but the strength was not there, and the motion faltered before it could become distance. His grip did not tighten. It did not need to. He already knew. "I can stand," she whispered, though the words carried less certainty than she wanted. A lie, and they both knew it. He did not call her on it. Instead, his hand shifted slightly at her back, a slow, grounding pressure that held her where she was without forcing her to admit she needed it. The firelight flickered across them, casting warm gold against the cold still lingering in her skin, reflecting in his eyes as he looked down at her, closer now than at any moment before. There was something in that look she had not seen earlier. Not just calculation, not just control, something heavier, something that made her breath catch again, softer this time, deeper. You walked through a storm that would have buried most people before they made it halfway, he said, his tone measured, but no longer distant. And you are still trying to stand like you do not need anything. Clara closed her eyes for a brief second, the truth of that pressing against her harder than the cold ever had. Need. She hated the word, hated what it meant. But her fingers tightened slightly against his coat anyway, betraying her before she could stop it. His gaze dropped to that small movement, then returned to her face, slower this time, as if he was seeing something new, something he had not allowed himself to see before. You said you would choose what you give, he continued, quieter now, the words threading through the warmth and the silence, anchoring her there. A pause, long enough to matter. His hand at her back did not move, but it changed, subtly, the pressure less about holding her up now and more about keeping her from slipping away. Then choose, he said. Not a command. Not quite. Something deeper. Clara's breath trembled as she lifted her head, her eyes meeting his again, closer than ever. The distance between them narrowed to something fragile and dangerous. The storm raged outside. The fire burned behind her. And between those two forces, she felt it clearly for the first time. Not just survival. Not just a deal. Something shifting. Something she could not take back. Her voice came out softer than she intended, but steadier than before. I cannot give you something I do not have, she said, the truth settling between them, raw and unguarded. A flicker crossed his expression, quick, almost imperceptible, but real. Not disappointment. Not rejection. Something else. Something that changed the air again. His hand moved, not away, but upward, briefly brushing against the back of her shoulder. A gesture so small it could have been nothing, and yet it wasn't. You are wrong, he said quietly. And for the first time since she stepped through that door, there was no distance left in his voice at all. You just have not realized it yet. The wind did not ease, it grew teeth. It slammed against the cabin in long, violent gusts that made the walls creak and the roof groan, as if the storm itself had decided this place should not stand. Clara felt it in her bones, in the way the warmth from the fire struggled to reach her fully, in the way the cold still clung stubbornly beneath her skin, no matter how close she stood to him. Ethan did not move away. Not yet. His hand remained at her back, steady, grounded, but his attention had shifted, drawn toward the sound of the storm with a sharpness that had not been there before. Listening, calculating, the kind of awareness that came from surviving too many winters like this. Clara noticed the change, the subtle tightening of his jaw, the way his gaze flicked once toward the door, then the window, then back to her, as if measuring time against something unseen. It is getting worse, she said softly, though she did not need to say it at all. He already knew. His hand left her then, not abruptly, but with purpose, and the absence of his touch hit her harder than she expected, the cold rushing back into the space he had occupied. He stepped away, moving across the room with quiet efficiency, each motion controlled, deliberate. As he checked the latch on the door, the edges of the window, the small details that kept a place like this standing when the world outside tried to tear it apart. Clara watched him, her arms instinctively wrapping around herself again, not just from the cold now, but from the sudden distance. The room felt larger without him close. Emptier. She hated that feeling, hated how quickly it had taken hold. Do storms like this last long? She asked, her voice carrying a hint of something she did not want to name. He did not answer right away. He stood near the window, his broad frame blocking part of the faint light, trying to seep through the frost-covered glass. His head tilted slightly, as if listening beyond what she could hear. Long enough, he said at last. Not reassuring. Not meant to be. Just truth. The fire crackled behind her, but the warmth felt thinner now, stretched by the growing sound of the storm, by the weight of his silence, by the realization settling slowly in her chest. She was not leaving. Not tonight. Maybe not tomorrow. The thought should have brought relief. Instead, it brought something else. Something tighter. I do not have anything left, she said suddenly, the words slipping out before she could stop them, before she could wrap them in something stronger. He turned then, slowly, his eyes finding hers again, sharper now, more focused. That is not true. His voice was quieter than before, but it carried more weight, more certainty. Clara shook her head, a small, almost stubborn motion, even as her body swayed slightly with the effort of staying upright. You do not know what I had, she said, her voice trembling, not just from the cold now, but from something deeper, something she had kept buried for too long. You do not know what I lost. The words hung there, fragile and dangerous, and for a moment she expected him to dismiss them, to turn away, to return to his careful distance. He did not. He stepped back toward her, slower this time, his presence filling the space again, not as close as before, but close enough to shift the air between them. No, he said, his gaze steady, unwavering. But I know what it looks like when someone has nothing left to lose. The firelight flickered across his face, catching something there she had not seen clearly until now. Not emptiness, not control, something harder, something earned. The storm howled louder, the sound pressing against the walls like a warning, like a countdown. Clara's breath hitched, her chest tightening as the weight of his words settled into her, as the truth of her situation sharpened into something impossible to ignore. She was here, alone, with him, and outside, there was nothing. No road, no town, no second chance. Her gaze dropped briefly, then lifted again, meeting his with a new kind of clarity, one that did not hide behind denial or pride. Then you know what I am risking by staying, she said, her voice softer now, but steadier. A beat. His eyes did not waver. And you know what you are risking if you leave. The words landed heavier than anything before them. Not a threat. A fact. The wind screamed again, and this time something else came with it, a sharp, unnatural sound beneath the howl, faint but distinct. A knock. Not on the door. From somewhere outside the cabin, carried through the storm. Both of them froze, the air between them tightening instantly as Ethan's head turned toward the sound, his entire posture shifting in a single, controlled motion. Clara's heart skipped, her breath catching as the realization hit her all at once. They were not as alone as they thought. The sound came again, sharper this time, cutting through the storm like something alive, something that did not belong to the wind or the night. Clara's breath stopped. Not outside anymore. Closer. Ethan did not hesitate. His entire body shifted in a single controlled motion, every line of him tightening with purpose as he moved toward the door, not fast, never careless, but with a certainty that made the air feel heavier. Stay here, he said, low and firm, the kind of command that did not ask to be questioned. Clara did not move, not because she obeyed, because she could not. The storm pressed harder against the cabin, rattling the wood, forcing thin drafts of cold air through every seam, making the fire flicker wildly behind her. Shadows stretched and twisted across the walls, and for a moment the room felt smaller, tighter, like the outside had found a way in. Another sound, a faint scrape this time, as if something brushed against the outer wall. Her heart pounded, loud enough she was sure he could hear it. Ethan's hand hovered near the latch, but he did not open it. He listened, always listening. The silence that followed was worse than the noise, thick and waiting, stretching long enough to make every second feel like a decision. Clara's gaze locked onto his back, onto the broad line of his shoulders as he stood between her and the door, between her and whatever waited outside. Protection. It was not spoken. It was not offered. It was simply there, and that made it harder to ignore. It could be someone, she said, her voice barely steady, but enough to break the silence, enough to shift the moment. He did not turn, or something that wants in. The words settled heavy, grounded in the kind of reality she had been running from since the storm began. Her arms tightened around herself, but it did nothing to stop the chill that crawled up her spine, not from the cold now, but from the unknown pressing against the walls. Another scrape. Closer. Clara took a step forward before she realized she was moving, drawn by something she could not name, fear or instinct or the need not to be alone in that moment. The floor creaked under her weight. Ethan turned then, his eyes finding hers instantly, sharp, focused, and closer than before because she had closed the distance without thinking. I told you to stay, he said, quieter now, but no less firm. Clara swallowed, her breath unsteady as she met his gaze, refusing to step back this time. And I told you, she answered, softer, but with something new in her voice, something that had not been there when she first crossed his threshold. I choose what I give. The words hung between them, charged, dangerous, shifting something deeper than either of them had planned. The storm roared outside, louder than ever, as if the world itself was pushing against the cabin, demanding entry, demanding a decision. Ethan's gaze did not waver. Not from her. Not now. For a second, everything else faded. The sound, the cold, the unknown. There was only the space between them, narrowed to almost nothing, her breath visible in the air, mingling with his, her pulse racing under the weight of his presence, his control, his restraint. His hand moved. Slowly. Not toward the door this time. Toward her. It stopped just short of her shoulder, hovering, giving her a chance to pull away. She did not. His fingers closed the distance, firm, steady, anchoring her in place, not holding her back, but holding her there. With him. The noise outside came again, louder now, unmistakable, something pressing against the cabin wall hard enough to make the wood groan. Clara flinched, instinct, her body shifting closer without thinking, and this time he did not step back, did not create space. His grip tightened just enough to steady her, his body angling slightly, placing himself between her and the sound without breaking eye contact. You feel that? He asked quietly. She nodded, her breath catching, her heart racing as the cabin seemed to shrink around them. The walls creaked again, the storm howling like it wanted to tear everything apart. And for a moment Clara realized the truth with a clarity that left no room for doubt. If she walked out that door, she would not survive. If he opened it, neither of them might. And yet neither of them moved. Neither of them looked away. His hand remained on her shoulder, grounding, unyielding, while his eyes held hers with a weight that felt like a choice she could not undo. If it comes through that door, he said, his voice lower now, closer, carrying something she had not heard before, not control, not distance, something deeper, something that reached past the storm and settled directly into her chest. You stay behind me. Her breath caught, her body going still as the meaning of that settled in, not as a command, but as something far more dangerous. A promise. The wood cracked sharply behind him, the sound loud enough to make the fire flicker violently, and Clara's eyes widened as the wall near the door shuddered under the pressure from outside, the barrier between them and whatever waited out there starting to give. The sound did not break through. It stopped, just as sudden as it had come. The pressure against the wall eased, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt unnatural, like the storm itself had taken a breath and forgotten to exhale. Clara did not realize she was holding on to him until her fingers tightened slightly against his coat, until the absence of movement outside made everything inside sharper, louder, more exposed. Ethan did not move either. His hand remained on her shoulder, firm, steady, but no longer bracing for impact. Waiting, listening. The fire cracked low behind them, weaker now, the flames settling into a quieter burn, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor and up the walls. The wind still howled beyond the cabin, but it had shifted, less violent, more distant, like something retreating without fully leaving. Clara's breath came slower, uneven at first, then steadier, the rise and fall of it brushing faintly against his chest where she still stood too close, closer than she had ever allowed herself to be with a stranger. She became aware of it all at once. The heat, the proximity, the way his presence filled the space around her, not as a threat, not anymore, but as something she had leaned into without thinking. Her hands loosened, just slightly, not enough to pull away, enough to feel the change. Ethan noticed. Of course he did. His gaze dropped briefly, catching the small shift, then lifted back to her face, slower this time, as if measuring something that had already begun to change between them. The tension had not disappeared. It had settled, deepened. Clara swallowed, her eyes lowering for the first time since she stepped into the cabin, not out of submission, but because looking at him now felt different, heavier, like it carried something she was not ready to name. It stopped, she said quietly, though she was not entirely sure it had. He did not answer right away. His hand moved, not away, but down, easing from her shoulder to her upper arm, a slower, more deliberate motion, as if testing whether she would pull back. She did not. The absence of resistance said more than any words could. "No," he said at last, his voice low, steady, but carrying a new weight. It moved. The words settled into her chest, colder than the air had been minutes ago. Her gaze lifted again, meeting his, searching, questioning, and this time she did not look away. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. His eyes held hers, unwavering, but something in them had shifted again, something darker now, more alert. "It means whatever was out there is not gone." A pause. The fire flickered, dimmer, the light softer, more fragile, as if the warmth itself was being tested. Clara felt it then, the change in the air, subtle but undeniable, the way the cabin seemed to hold its breath along with them. She stepped back this time. Just one step. Enough to create space. Enough to feel the loss of his warmth immediately, the cold creeping back into the edges of her awareness. He let her go. Did not follow. But he did not turn away either. The distance between them was small. It felt larger. Different. Irreversible. She wrapped her arms around herself again. But the gesture felt hollow now, insufficient, as if something inside her had already shifted out of place and would not return. Her eyes drifted toward the door, toward the wall that had shuddered under unseen pressure, toward the boundary that no longer felt as solid as it had before. "You said I would not walk out that door," she murmured, more to herself than to him. A beat. His voice came after, quieter than before, but closer in a way that did not depend on distance. "You will not." Clara closed her eyes for a brief second, the certainty in his tone settling into her, not as reassurance, not as control, but as something she had already begun to accept. When she opened them again, the room felt different. Smaller, warmer, more dangerous. The fire crackled softly. The wind whispered outside. And somewhere beyond the walls, something shifted again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if it had found exactly what it was looking for. The silence did not settle this time. It stretched, thin and fragile, like something waiting to snap. Clara stood there with her arms wrapped around herself, but her gaze did not drift back to the door again. It stayed on him, steadier now, more certain. Something had shifted inside her, something the storm had carved out and left exposed, and she was no longer trying to hide it. Ethan saw it immediately, the way her shoulders straightened despite the exhaustion still clinging to her frame, the way her eyes no longer searched for permission. He did not move, but the space between them changed anyway. "You said everything out here is a trade," she said quietly, her voice calm in a way it had not been before, as if the fear had burned off and left something sharper behind. He did not interrupt, did not soften. He simply watched. "Then I have something you want," she added, and this time the words landed differently. Not a plea, not survival, a statement. His gaze narrowed just slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus, like a man adjusting to a new variable he had not accounted for. "You assume a lot," he said, his voice low, controlled, but there was a thread of something else beneath it now. Curiosity. Clara took a step closer. Not enough to close the distance completely. Enough to change the balance. The firelight caught in her eyes, reflecting something steadier than before, something that did not break under his gaze. "No," she said, softer now, but certain. I listened. A pause. The wind whispered along the walls, quieter now, but still there, still watching. "You do not need hands," she continued, her voice even, measured, as if she were laying something out piece by piece. "You do not need help." Her eyes held his. "You need someone who stays." The words settled between them, heavier than anything before, because they were not guessed. They were known. Ethan did not react immediately, but the stillness in him changed. Subtle, deep. His jaw tightened just enough to notice, his breath slowing in a way that did not match the quiet in the room. "You think you understand that?" he asked, and for the first time, there was no distance in the question. No safety. Clara's fingers loosened at her sides, her posture no longer defensive, no longer bracing. "I think," she said carefully, "you built this place so you would not have to need anyone." The fire cracked low behind her, the sound sharp in the quiet, and something in his expression shifted, not visible in full, but felt, like the ground beneath them had moved just enough to throw everything slightly off balance. She stepped closer again. Now there was barely any space left. Her breath mingled with his in the cold air that still lingered at the edges of the room. Her presence no longer fragile, no longer something he could measure and dismiss. "But you still opened the door," she added, her voice barely above a whisper now. A beat. Long, heavy. Ethan's gaze locked onto hers, and this time there was no mistaking it. The control was still there, but something else had surfaced beneath it. Something older. Something that had been buried for a long time. His hand moved, not to hold her, not to stop her, but to brace against the table beside her, close enough that she could feel the shift in the air, the grounding force of him choosing not to touch her when he easily could. "You are wrong about one thing," he said quietly. Clara did not step back. "What is that?" she asked. His eyes did not leave hers. "I did not open the door because I needed someone," he said, his voice steady, but carrying a weight that had not been there before. A pause. Then, softer. Closer. "I opened it because I recognized you." The words hit differently. Clara's breath caught, her mind struggling to catch up with something that did not fit the story she had built in her head. "That is not possible," she said, but the certainty in her voice had faltered. Ethan held her gaze, unyielding now, the truth in his expression leaving no room to dismiss it. "3 winters ago," he said slowly, each word deliberate, "a teacher passed through this territory, headed east. Alone." Clara's heart skipped. Just once. Hard enough to hurt. The room seemed to tighten again, the fire dimming, the air growing heavier as something long buried rose to the surface. "She never made it out of the mountains," he continued, his voice quieter now, but sharper, cutting through everything she thought she knew. "They said the storm took her." A beat. His gaze did not soften. "But I found her." Clara's breath stopped completely this time, her body going still as the truth began to shift beneath her feet, as the past she thought was behind her suddenly stood right in front of her. And for the first time since she stepped into that cabin, she realized he had known exactly who she was all along. Clara did not step back. She could not. The storm outside surged again, louder than before, as if the world itself had been waiting for this moment, for this truth to rise between them and demand an answer. Her heart pounded hard enough to make her chest ache, her breath shallow, uneven, visible in the cold air that had crept back into the room despite the fire. "You are lying," she said, but the words came out softer than they should have, thinner, as if part of her already knew they would not hold. Ethan did not move. He did not look away. The distance between them was almost gone now, narrowed to something fragile and dangerous, something that made every breath feel shared, every second feel like it carried weight. "You remember the ridge," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the storm, steady and unyielding. "The one with the broken fence and the dead pine at the top." Clara's breath caught, not just from the cold, from memory. The image rose uninvited, sharp and immediate. The way the sky had darkened too fast, the way the wind had shifted without warning, the way she had told herself she could make it through if she just kept moving. "You fell before you reached the other side," he continued, closer now, his voice lower, as if the past itself had stepped into the room with them. "You did not get back up." The fire flickered, casting shadows that moved across his face, across hers, across the space where everything had begun to change. Clara shook her head, once, then again, the motion small but desperate, as if she could push the truth back into the storm where it belonged. "No," she whispered, but it was not denial anymore. It was fear. "I walked out." Ethan's gaze did not soften, not even a little. "You think you did," he said, and the words landed heavier than anything before them. The wind slammed against the cabin again, rattling the door, making the walls groan under the pressure, as if the storm itself refused to be ignored. Clara felt it then, the fracture in her own memory. The space where something did not line up, where the timeline blurred, where the cold had swallowed more than just her strength. Her chest tightened, her breath catching as the weight of it pressed down on her. "Why did you not say anything?" she asked, her voice barely holding together, the question rising from somewhere deeper than anger, deeper than confusion. Something raw, something unguarded. Ethan's jaw tightened, just slightly, the first real crack in the control he had held so carefully since she arrived. "Because you were leaving," he said, the words quiet, but sharp enough to cut through everything else. A pause, the kind that changed things. And I was not going to stop you. Clara stared at him, her pulse racing, her thoughts colliding with something she could not yet fully understand. You could have, she said, the accusation slipping through before she could stop it. You knew who I was. His eyes held hers, steady, unflinching, but there was something deeper there now, something that had been buried under layers of restraint and silence. I do not keep people who want to leave, he said, each word deliberate, grounded in something older than this moment, something shaped long before she ever stepped onto his land. The truth of it hit her harder than anything else. Not control, not ownership. Choice. Always choice. The storm roared again, louder than ever, as if it was closing in, as if time itself was running out. Clara's breath came faster now, her chest rising and falling as the weight of everything pressed down on her at once. The past. The present. The man standing in front of her who had known her before she even knew herself. Then why did you open the door tonight? She asked, her voice trembling, but stronger now, driven by something she could not ignore anymore. Ethan stepped closer. The last inch of space disappeared. His presence filled everything, grounding, steady, impossible to escape. His voice dropped, low enough that she felt it more than heard it. Because this time, he said, his eyes locked onto hers, holding her there, leaving no room to turn away. You did not walk away. Clara's breath caught, her entire body going still as the meaning settled in, as the choice in front of her became impossible to ignore. The storm outside howled like it was trying to tear the world apart. The fire behind her flickered low, the warmth fading, the light thinning. And between those two forces, she stood on the edge of something she could not step back from. Stay or leave. Be alone or not. Her hand lifted, slow, uncertain, hovering for a second before it found the front of his coat again, not gripping this time, not clinging, just resting there, as if testing the weight of the choice she was about to make. Ethan did not move, did not reach for her. He waited, always waited, giving her the space to decide, even now, even here, when everything else was closing in. Clara swallowed, her eyes searching his one last time, looking for something that would make it easier, something that would take the choice out of her hands. She did not find it. Only him. Steady, unyielding, present. Her breath trembled as the words rose, fragile and irreversible, forming at the edge of her lips, as the storm pressed harder against the cabin, as the night closed in around them, as the moment stretched to its breaking point and refused to release. The storm did not end all at once. It faded, slowly, like something pulling back into the distance, leaving behind a silence that felt almost fragile in its absence. The wind no longer screamed. It whispered, brushing lightly against the cabin walls, and the fire had burned down to a low, steady glow, its warmth softer now, less urgent, more enduring. Clara stood where she was, her hand still resting against his coat, her breath finally beginning to slow, each inhale less sharp, less desperate than the last. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They did not need to. The choice had already been made, not in words, in stillness. Ethan's gaze remained on hers, but something in it had shifted, not the sharp control that had defined him before, not the distance that had kept everything measured and contained. It was quieter now, deeper, as if he was no longer watching for what she might do, but simply seeing her. His hand moved, not to take hold, not to claim, but to rest lightly over hers where it touched his coat, a grounding gesture, steady and unforced, as if acknowledging something that no longer needed to be tested. Clara felt it immediately, the difference in that touch. The absence of pressure, the absence of demand. Just presence, just warmth. Her fingers did not pull away. They settled there instead, more certain this time, less hesitant, as if the space between them had finally found its shape. Outside, the sky had begun to change. The faintest light crept through the frost-lined window, pale and cold, the first sign of morning pushing against the night that had nearly swallowed everything. Clara turned her head slightly, her gaze drifting toward that thin line of dawn, the world beyond still harsh, still unforgiving, but no longer impossible. When she looked back at him, something inside her had quieted. Not fear, not completely, but the sharp edge of it had softened into something else, something steadier. I stayed, she said softly, the words simple, but carrying everything that had led to this moment. Ethan nodded once, slow, deliberate, his eyes never leaving hers. "You chose to," he replied, and there was no weight of expectation in it. No claim, only recognition. That mattered, more than she expected. The fire cracked gently behind her, the sound warm and familiar now, no longer fighting the cold, but holding it at bay. Clara drew in a breath, deeper this time, her shoulders easing as the tension that had held her tight for so long finally loosened. She did not step away. Neither did he. The distance between them remained small, but it no longer felt like a boundary. It felt like something shared. His hand shifted slightly over hers, a small movement, almost imperceptible, but enough to draw her attention back fully, enough to remind her that this was real, that this moment was not something the storm would take when it passed. "You can still leave when the road clears," he said quietly, the words offered without hesitation, without fear, as if he had already accepted whatever answer might come. Clara held his gaze, steady now, unflinching, and for the first time, the idea of leaving did not feel like survival. It felt like loss. She shook her head, just once, a small motion, but certain. "No," she said, her voice calm, grounded, no longer carried by desperation or fear. "I think I already know where I am staying." The words settled between them, not heavy, not forced, but right. Ethan did not smile. He did not move closer, but something in him eased. Something that had been held tight for too long finally loosening in a way that did not need to be seen to be understood. The first light of morning grew stronger, slipping through the window, touching the edges of the room, catching in her hair, in his eyes, in the quiet space they now shared. Outside, the storm had passed. Inside, something else had begun. And in that stillness, in that fragile, steady warmth, it became clear that sometimes the hardest thing to survive was not the storm, but the moment after, when you finally had a choice and chose to stay anyway. Morning did not arrive with warmth, it arrived with clarity. A pale, colorless light slipped through the narrow seams of the wooden shutters, stretching slowly across the cabin floor, touching everything it reached with a quiet honesty that the night had hidden. The storm had passed, but the cold lingered, thin and persistent, clinging to the air, to the walls, to the skin. Clara stood near the window now, her arms no longer wrapped tightly around herself, but resting more loosely, as if her body had begun to trust the stillness around her. Outside, the land was transformed. Snow lay untouched across the plains, smooth and endless, the wind reduced to a soft whisper that carried no threat, only distance. It looked peaceful. It was not. She knew that now. Behind her, the fire burned low, steady, no longer fighting, simply existing, its soft crackle filling the silence in a way that felt almost grounding. Ethan moved within that quiet, his presence no longer sharp or commanding, but still unmistakable. He added a piece of wood to the fire without speaking, the small action deliberate, practical, yet carrying something more. Continuation. Care. Clara watched him from the corner of her eye, not turning fully, not needing to. The tension between them had not disappeared. It had changed shape. It no longer pressed. It lingered. A memory held just beneath the surface, present in the way her breath slowed when he moved closer, in the way his gaze paused on her a second longer than necessary. He did not approach her immediately. He gave her space. Not distance. Space. There was a difference now. Clara turned slightly, enough to meet his eyes, and for a moment neither of them spoke. They did not rush to fill the silence. It was no longer something to escape. It was something to stand within. "The road will be buried," she said softly, her voice calm, grounded, carrying none of the desperation that had brought her here. Ethan nodded once, his gaze steady. "For a few days," he replied. No urgency, no expectation, just fact. Clara absorbed that, her eyes drifting briefly back to the window, to the wide, empty stretch of land that no longer called to her the same way it once had. Freedom used to mean movement. Now it felt different. Now it felt like choice. And she had already made hers. She turned back to him fully this time, her posture straighter, her presence no longer fragile or uncertain. The woman who had arrived at his door and the one standing here now were not the same. The storm had taken something. It had also given something back. "You said I could leave," she murmured, her tone even, reflective, as if testing the words against what she now understood. Ethan did not look away. "You can," he said. "Still true. Always true." That had not changed. Clara held his gaze, searching it not for permission, but for confirmation of something deeper, something quieter. She stepped forward, slow, measured, closing part of the space between them, not out of need, not out of fear, but out of decision. "And if I stay," she continued, her voice softer now, but no less certain, "it is not because I have nowhere else to go." A pause. The fire shifted behind her, sending a soft glow across the room, catching in his eyes as he watched her, really watched her, without the distance that had once defined him. "I know," he said, and there was something in his voice now that had not been there before. Not control, not restraint, recognition. Clara's breath eased, her shoulders relaxing just slightly as the weight of that acknowledgement settled into her. It was enough, more than enough. She moved past him then, not brushing against him, not avoiding him either, simply moving within the same space, the same rhythm, as if the cabin itself had reshaped around the both of them. She paused near the table, her fingers grazing the surface lightly, grounding herself in something real, something present. Ethan turned slightly as she passed, his gaze following, not possessive, not distant, simply aware. The kind of awareness that did not demand, but remained. Outside, the light grew stronger, the day beginning in quiet layers, untouched and waiting. Inside, the air held a different kind of stillness now, one that carried the weight of everything that had happened, everything that had changed, and everything that would not return to what it had been before. Clara glanced back at him once more, her eyes steady, her expression softer, but no less certain, and in that brief moment, it was clear that whatever had begun in the storm was not something the morning would undo, only something it would reveal more fully. The sky stretched wide and endless, painted in long strokes of gold and fading amber as the sun lowered itself across the open plains, the kind of quiet that only came after something had been survived settling into the land like a final breath. The snow had begun to melt at the edges, revealing patches of dry earth beneath, dark and steady, as if the ground itself had waited patiently for the storm to pass. Clara stood just outside the cabin, her boots pressing lightly into the softened surface, her gaze following the horizon as it seemed to go on forever, no longer threatening, no longer empty, just open. The wind moved gently now, nothing like before, brushing against her hair, her face, carrying the scent of earth and distance instead of cold and fear. Behind her, the cabin door creaked softly as it opened, a familiar sound now, one that no longer carried uncertainty. She did not turn right away. She did not need to. She felt him there. Ethan stepped out onto the porch, his presence steady, grounded, the weight of him not something that closed in, but something that held its place beside her without question. For a moment, he simply stood there, his eyes on her, taking in the way she faced the land now, not as something to escape, but as something she had chosen to remain within. The light caught in her hair, in the lines of her face, no longer drawn tight with exhaustion, but softer, stronger, shaped by everything she had endured and everything she had decided. He stepped down from the porch slowly, the wood creaking under his boots, then settling as he crossed the short distance between them. He did not rush. He never had. When he reached her, he stopped just at her side, close enough that their shoulders nearly aligned, far enough that the choice of closeness remained untouched. Clara glanced toward him then, her eyes meeting his, and this time there was no hesitation, no searching, only a quiet certainty that had not been there before. The silence between them held, but it was no longer heavy. It was full. "It looks different," she said softly, her voice carried by the breeze, not lost to it. Ethan followed her gaze out across the plains, his expression steady, thoughtful. "It always does after a storm," he replied. A simple truth, but not a small one. Clara nodded slightly, her eyes tracing the line where the sky met the land, where everything stretched forward into something unknown but no longer feared. Her hand moved then, not reaching for him, not asking, just resting lightly against his arm, a small, deliberate choice that spoke louder than anything she could have said. He felt it. Of course he did. His gaze dropped briefly to where her hand met his sleeve, then lifted back to her face, slower this time, as if marking the moment, as if understanding exactly what it meant. His hand rose in return, not to take hold, not to pull her closer, but to settle gently over hers, steady, grounding, a quiet answer that did not need words. They stood like that, side by side, the wind moving softly around them, the last light of the day stretching long across the land, turning everything it touched into something warmer, something enduring. The world beyond remained vast, unpredictable, and unforgiving, but it was no longer something she faced alone, and he no longer stood apart from it, watching from a distance. Somewhere along the line, without force, without demand, they had chosen the same ground. The sun dipped lower, the horizon glowing, and for a moment the entire world seemed to hold still, balanced between what had been and what would come next. Clara's fingers shifted slightly beneath his hand, not pulling away, not tightening, simply settling more naturally into place, as if they had always belonged there. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath steady, the kind that came when something long held was finally released. Neither of them spoke again. They did not need to. The answer had already been given, not in words, but in presence, in stillness, in the quiet understanding that had replaced everything that came before. And as the last light faded and the first stars began to appear above the wide, open sky, it became clear that sometimes the strongest bonds were not forged in the storm itself, but in the moment you chose to stand and stay when the storm was finally gone.